Welcome, colleagues, to an LA workshop around the Authority Proforma tool. My name's Andy Humphries. I work in the data unit of the Operational Excellence Division. A colleague, Bill Baxter, is on the call as well, who will keep me in line, making sure that I'm not saying anything untoward. Gaspar is also listed on here. Unfortunately, Gaspar can't make it today. But myself and Bill, we hope we'll be able to answer any queries that you have. We are talking about the completion of the Authority Proforma tool. You've currently got the modelling version, and the final version will come out later in the term after the census has been signed off, because of course we are reliant on October census data to populate the APT. So once we've had that signed off, then we'll get an APT out to you. The session will highlight how we check the APTs, some of the reasons why LA sometimes have to resubmit an APT. We'll give you the chance to raise issues that you are having with the modelling APT, and hopefully we'll be able to get those resolved for you. And to highlight, we are going to run some sessions in December and January in addition, primarily because you'll have your final data and your final APT at that point, and there may be some very specific scenarios that you need to cover that you haven't encountered before and you weren't anticipating, but have arisen by the time the final version comes out. So we'll do some much more open sessions in December and January, whether this is going to cover some very specific subject areas. All of this to try and reduce turnaround time later when we get to the slightly frenetic point where APTs are being submitted and checked and turned around and hopefully signed off in a pretty straightforward manner. So hopefully that's what you're attending. And I'll just quickly cover the process. We have got a little bit more time than previously. That was because we have got a bit more to cover than I'd previously anticipated in the dry run. The APTs, we'll send them out to local authorities in early December after the October census has been locked down. And of course, local authorities will then complete their APT. It says amend there, and it's not a very big box, but it's a huge amount of work that we thoroughly appreciate that you'll be doing in the period from release to the deadline on the 20th of January. You will return the APTs to the ESFA, and you'll get an email notification thanking you for that. And we'll download the file and do some validation checks. If those validation checks are passed, then it moves on to the next stage. If those validation checks are failed, we will come back to you at that point. We will not do any more of the checking, and we'll ask you to complete the APT so that those validation checks are passed. I'll cover a couple of the common errors with the validation checks shortly, so hopefully people can avoid those and prevent kind of a 2-day pause in the cycle of the validation process. We will pass the APT on to a colleague in the funding directorate who will be the team lead, and they'll then allocate the APT, the LA, to a member of their team to do the checks on. These are called compliance checks in the main, and as they are being undertaken as well, we'll also carry out what's called a sense check panel, which is where we will look at the APT values that you've used in the round across a national distribution. So the compliance checks are checking that you've essentially complied with the regulations. You're not doing things that you are not supposed to do and we don't want you to do. And then the sense check panel covers checks whereby it's perfectly possible to do it, but is it reasonable? So for example, a compliance check might be that you have not put non-premises date adjustments in the wrong place, or that you haven't made pupil-led adjustments or changed pupil numbers downwards without the express permission of us to do so. Whereas a reasonableness check might be that although the total amount of money allocated through PFI is the same as last year or within a threshold, you haven't allocated it to the same schools. So we'd want to check that, is that right? Has the need moved? That's unlikely, and we'd probably change it. Or it might be that the PFI value has gone up significantly. It's not a problem necessarily that it goes up. We're simply making sure that you're happy with the numbers you've put in. Okay, so that's the difference between a compliance and a reasonableness check. Once all of those are passed, we'll send an email to you and you can then issue your allocations, and we'll use that data to calculate academy allocations. So that's that process. Our aim here is to try and reduce the number of times each LA goes round this circle. We would like you to go around once and it will be completed. We appreciate that that can sometimes be very tricky to do, but what we would then like is that it isn't gone round more than a second time. The fewer times we go around it, the quicker you get your APT back, the earlier you can get your allocations out. Okay, which is what we'd like. There's currently 35 compliance checks that we do and 16 reasonableness checks, and there's 58 checks within the APT. That's all on the validation sheet, which is on the far right hand side of all the sheets that are on the APT. And there are several regular areas where checks have failed. Some of the validation checks in the APT have failed. Some of the ones that we have to do externally have failed. There's quite a few issues that we have to go back to local authorities about regarding the inputs and adjustments worksheet, particularly around changing pupil numbers and the difference between how you do it for a school that already exists and how you do it for a school that doesn't currently exist and you need to add that provider in for the first time. There are often issues around the miscategorization of what a new and growing school is and how we use the numbers that LA's put into the high needs columns on the local factors sheet. So we'll cover that. We'll cover the recoupment worksheet and specifically about values for growth payments. And I'll also have just cover off what we mean by political ratification and making sure that those dates are all lined up from your point of view and to the regulations. So some simple validation checks. A really common one is that we can't accept an APT if it's got a link to another file. Now, we know that you will be working off spreadsheets and data sets outside of the APT. You'll have your own lists for providers with PFI and the NNDR values and all that sort of thing. Okay, totally reasonable. And totally reasonable that you would bring those in using a formula to make sure that the matching of the data that you want to bring in matches to the school in the APT. But you must then, once you've done it, before you submit your APT to us, you must break links. So under the data option in the APT, click the edit links button, make sure that's grayed out. If it isn't, then you'll click on it and break the links and then save it. By all means, save your APT as another version at that point. So you've still got a version with links in it, but you must send us the one without the links in. Often it's something that people forget when they have had to resubmit anyway. So it's often the second or even the third version of the APT that they're sending in that they've remembered to break links the first time, but it catches them out the second time. So do make sure that you're breaking links just before and saving a separate copy, if you like, just before you send the new version of the APT into us. It then just cuts out us having to say, sorry, we need you to break the links and resend it. Check the validation sheet. Are there any red flags? Now, this is a picture of the validation sheet rather than a live copy. But if you've got any red flags on the APT as we receive it, we'll send it back and ask you to resolve them. In Excel, there are comment boxes on all of the descriptions of the check flag, and they will help you understand why the failure is happening and what to do to resolve it. This is true for this area that you can see, which is in the top left-hand side of the validation sheet, but it is also true for the school level table. As you scroll down the validation sheet, it will tell you which area the flag is presenting a problem, which area the APT is causing it, and also what to do to resolve it and for which school. So it's often that you've put an exceptional circumstance or a specific adjustment into the local factors sheet for a local authority for a provider, but you haven't put a comment in to explain what that adjustment is for. Okay, so if there's a value, it does need a comment to explain what it's for. It won't check that what you've explained is appropriate and complete. We will still check that, but it will at least say that there is a comment alongside every adjustment, which certainly helps us. Okay, so the the validation sheet will give you a clue as to what the problem is and for which provider. Okay, so look to resolve that, and then once you have no red flags, then you can submit it. If you cannot clear a red flag, it simply will not budge no matter what you do, then do drop an email to the APT submissions.questions mailbox, and we'll look to help you. But there are plenty of text in the validation sheet and on the columns at school level to help you resolve those before you get to that point. Do check that all newly opening free schools are listed or confirm to us they're not going to open in the commentary sheet. You can add it onto the bottom under any other supporting commentary. We will provide to you on one of the yellow tabs at the start any free schools that we believe, according to the colleagues that working with projects looking to open, who are the ones that at the point of release of the APT, or certainly in December of this year, who are the projects looking to open. It may be that you'll have intelligence after that point that says the project isn't going to happen. But if you're not sure, if it's a bit touch and go, it's far better to include them. Because if they don't open, we won't recoup the money off the APT for that project. But if you don't include it and they do open, then we need to recoup for them. So then you've got to work out how you're going to afford that. Okay, so it is far better if there's a chance that the school is going to open that you account for it in the APT. Okay, rather than having to do some adjustments with your growth fund and possibly other sources to recoup for the school that opened that you didn't budget for. Okay. Check for any outlier per pupil rates in the baseline. I've got an example there where there's a school where the MFG per pupil is only £2,200, highly unlikely given the floor, given the ARPU rates now in play in the NFF. A rate of £2,200 is highly unlikely. The example there shows a much lower baseline than would be expected. It is likely to happen for a school that opened in the current year that we're sitting in. So for the 23-24 APT, it might be most likely to have happened for a school that opened in September 2022. And what's happened is that either you've made an adjustment to the pupil numbers or to the allocation that doesn't match up. So you may have increased the pupil numbers to the full year value, but you haven't increased the cash. That would reduce the MFG rate. Or you've added more cash in, but you haven't increased the pupil numbers, and therefore you'd have a very high baseline. Okay, so have a look at that and check that you've got the MFG rates are within an expected range for your local authority. Clearly, different LAs will have different rates per pupil, and different phases will have different rates per pupil as a range. But do have a look, and if you've got any very low or very high ones in the baseline sheet, then do just check that if you haven't made an adjustment, that it is flowing through from the baselines that we provide. And if that's the case, then that's absolutely fine. Okay. So now moving on to some of the work that we do with once an APT has passed the validation area, is a lot of work is done in inputs and adjustments. And the first bit I want to cover is work that LAs do that they don't need to. So hopefully we're helping you out by not having to do something here that quite a few LAs have done in the past. If you are not changing any of the school block factors, so I'm thinking free school meal eligibility, FSM6, the IDACI profile, etc., then you don't need to put it in. So you may be, changing a school's academy status because it's recently converted. You may be adding pupils. That's all fine. But if you're not wanting to change any of the factor data, then don't put anything in it at all. Don't put naught in, because naught's a number, and that will actually then mean that school wouldn't get funded for that factor. Okay, so just leave it blank. The APT will account for that, and we'll look to the schools block data worksheet instead and apply it. So if you put something in, then we need to check that what you've put in is appropriate. Okay, if you leave it blank, then we don't need to do anything. So we're saving you time by not having to enter something, and you're saving us time by not having to check that what you've put in is no different unless you have permission to change something. Okay, so columns AD to column BH on the inputs and adjustment sheet, for most providers, you don't need to do anything. For brand new provision, clearly you'll need to add something in, and we do provide local authority averages for the new free schools, and they will need that data adding in. But that's appropriate because they should be funded for the pupil-led factors based on a figure that either the one we've provided as the LA average or as a more focused average, if you like, perhaps the 2 or 3 schools nearest to them. But don't put something in if you're not planning on changing anything. Okay. The most common changes are pupil number related on the inputs and adjustments, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But last year, changes were also due to LAs for infant schools needing to amend the low prior attainment average because the LA average was too far away from essentially the position for that school that would have been fair, and that was appropriate. And some LAs needed to change the London fringe. Of course, that only applies to 5 local authorities who are in the fringe area. The other thing becoming less common but has happened and is perfectly appropriate is where there are occasionally a primary age pupil in the census at a secondary school, and that by default would attract primary basic entitlement funding when it should be secondary, it should be at Key Stage 3. And similarly, we'll occasionally have a secondary age pupil in a primary school, and that would normally attract secondary school rates of funding when it needs to be primary. So merely zeroing out the secondary school and adding a pupil to the primary range instead is perfectly appropriate. It doesn't happen often, but we have had it and it is permissible. Also, you need to list any schools that have become an academy since the October 22 census. So we'll have the October 2022 converters listed, but any that have converted after that point will not have included. Okay, so please do make sure that that has been updated. Check your recoupment tab so that all those that you expect to be listed are. Again, this is only for mainstream. So the APT only focuses on mainstream provision. We don't need you to include special schools that have converted in your area since October. And then the other area is the amalgamation of 2 or more schools, or indeed that schools are closing. So essentially a reorganisation is being undertaken in your locality, and you need to reflect that in the APT. So changing pupil numbers for providers that already exist. Now, I'm making this very specific. This is about schools and academies whereby the school is listed on the October census, but you need to change the pupil numbers. Where they are not listed on the October 22 census at all and have no predecessor, then the process is slightly different, and I shall come to that in a minute. So changing pupil numbers for existing providers. This is not necessarily just for schools that are listed as new and growing. Okay, you can add pupils in over and above the October census if it is appropriate for schools that are taking on additional pupils whereby the lag census would not be appropriate. Okay, it provides too much of a difference for the school in terms of how many pupils they are funded for. Okay, you must do it for new and growing schools. You can also do it for schools that are growing but are not necessarily new. It's often for a structural change. You may be moving from a 3-tier system to a 2-tier system, or an infant and a junior is merging, that sort of thing. But either way, you carry it out on the inputs and adjustment sheet. Usually that will happen halfway through the financial year, or 5/12 of the way through it in September. So what you will be doing is funding the additional pupils for 7 months of the year. So the starting point should be the schools block data set. So you start at that point and then add the extra pupils that you want to fund for the appropriate amount of time that they are there. So if the starting point is you've got a primary school that's got 30 pupils in every year group, and from September it's going to add an extra class, you would of 30, then you would want to fund the 210 for the full year and 30 additional pupils for 7 months of the year. So you'd add 7/12 of 30 to the total funded pupil number for that school. It may be that for a relatively new school that is still growing into its year groups, you have an agreement to guarantee a level of funding through the number of pupils that are going to be funded. If so, then in column BI of the inputs and adjustment sheet, you would put yes. You should also put a yes in column BK to show that you are making an adjustment for part of the year, and indicate BL if there's 2 changes over 2 time periods. So it may be that you have a school taking some pupils on from the start of the financial year, so you want to fund that change for the whole year, and you want to fund some additional pupils joining from the September. If that's the case, then put yes in column BL. That then makes sure that ESFA know, that we know, that simply multiplying the difference to re-engineer the amount of pupils won't work. We have to do it slightly differently, and we'll take those out as individual cases and work them through. Okay, so if the October census is not right, and it's because you want to fund additional pupils for the full year and some more pupils for part of the year, then do put yes in column BL. Okay, then you confirm the number of months that the pupil number changes for. If you've got 2 changes, then that number is irrelevant because that's not going to work. So you can leave that blank if you're putting a yes in BL. Okay, but usually the change is for 7 months. Occasionally it's 12 if the change is for the full year and for the full year only. And then in columns BN, BO and BP, we would like you to indicate what the academic year number is that you are essentially funding the financial year equivalent of. This is so that we can check that the commentary that you've provided matches the numbers that you've calculated. We have had occasions where an LA has said there's going to be an extra 30 pupils joining the school in September, so I'm funding 7/12 of 30. But the calculation has funded 7/12 of 25, for example. Now, we aren't going to make a decision about whether it's an extra 30 or an extra 25. We're going to come back to you to say which one is it. Okay, so it then means that we can fund academies correctly from the September because their financial year matches the academic year. But we aren't going to decide which it is. We need you to confirm. So we're trying to make sure that we have got, if you like, a description and a calculation that match up, because then we're assured that the LA have described what they intend and calculated correctly, because we've got 2 ways of looking at it. If there's a contradiction, then we'll come back to you. If you are aware of additional pupils going to be joining the school, then you should use this approach to increase that pupil number. The growth fund really is for where you aren't aware or haven't agreed where the growth is going to happen, and is for a structural reason. Okay, so this is the approach that you should use where the numbers are pretty secure and that growth is known, it's planned and is aware of. The growth fund, kept separately, is for where growth occurs that wasn't necessarily anticipated precisely, that you knew which school it was and the volume at the point the APT was submitted. Okay. So here's a bit of a pictorial representation of what some of those columns look like. The commentary must confirm the approach, so you describe the problem, what your starting point number is, and what the additional will be, and what that total then comes to. We'd recommend that you start with the schools block, so pick out the cell on the schools block for that school, and then make the adjustment. You can use columns in the subtotals. So column R, S, V, W, and X are actually subtotals of other columns. So if you actually ask it just to total those columns up, it then means if you have to make a late change to the specific year group pupil numbers, all your other totals will work and you won't have any mismatches. And the data that you put into columns BN, BO, and BP, as I mentioned, will be reflected in the purple columns, which are calculated columns in BS, BT, and BW if you filled these three columns incorrectly. If you have to adjust for more than 1 point in the year, then those purple columns won't match, and don't try to make them match because that won't work. Okay, but where you're only making the change for one part of the year, columns BN to BP should match columns BS, BT, and BW. Okay, so different types of commentary in there. The clearer it is, the less chance that we need to come back to you to query it. Okay, so A, clarity, and B, that they match to the calculations that you've done will pretty much ensure that we are happy with what you've put, and we won't need to come back to you to ask for some clarity or to resubmit. Okay, so that's for existing providers. And remember that decimal places in columns R to AC are perfectly acceptable. We know that you have a starting point based on a pupil number. You have a point partway through the year, and when you mix those months together, you can get decimals, but that's perfectly acceptable. The financial year is pretty much an artificial construct. So if you're funding 0.5 of a pupil, that's because a pupil is there for part of the year and therefore doesn't necessarily attract the funding for the whole year. Perfectly acceptable. Okay. And remember that for a school that is new and growing, that you should be funding the year groups that they are currently in for the period April to August, and then the year groups they're going to be in, plus the extra year group in reception or Y7 for 7/12 of the year, while those year groups are moving through. Okay, so the formula can get a little more complicated for the new and growing schools because you're funding the current number for 5 months, then the current number plus additional pupils for the other 7. Okay. So now new providers. Now this is for, as I say, brand new providers that do not currently exist and have not got a predecessor. So where we're talking about a school becoming an academy, I know it's a new provider, but it's not brand new. It has a predecessor. Okay, but we're talking here essentially about new free schools. Okay, they usually open in September, which means the whole allocation should reflect a part year funding level, including the lump sum, which means you do not put the pupil numbers in, you put them in the same columns, but you don't use the same adjustment technique. Okay, so you will complete the inputs and adjustment sheet using the actual pupil numbers. So if you think the school is going to open with 120 pupils in it, you put 120 pupils in the inputs and adjustments. Okay. Remember to flag in column BI of inputs and adjustments whether they're guaranteed or not. So you may be ensuring a level of viability for the new project, having agreed that with them beforehand. Okay, and add the provider factor data or your preferred equivalent with an explanation into the inputs and adjustments as well. Okay, but then the key difference is you move to column O of the local factors sheet and type into that column a formula that reflects the amount of time that that school is open in this coming financial year. So if they're going to open in September, you will put equals 7/12. That then applies a pro rata to the pupil-led factors and the lump sum. Okay. If you do it the other way, the lump sum won't be apportioned and you'll be over recouped. Essentially, you'll be giving them too much money and we would recoup more than we should. Okay. If you have additional factors such as PFI or a split site, you need to put those in at the value you want them to receive as funding. Okay. The opening closing column is not applied to the premises costs. Okay, so pro rata the premises cost yourself. The rest will be done using that opening closing column. Okay, and if you don't, we will be recouping for a full lump sum, which of course the school is not entitled to because it's not been open the full year. So if it's only going to open in January, then you would put equals 3/12 in the local factors sheet because it's only open for January, February, March 2024. Okay. Now, I've mentioned a couple of times the description of new and growing schools, and there is a specific definition of what a new and growing school is. It must not have all of the expected year groups populated. Okay. Now, there's a caveat on that, that a school that was established as a secondary school, but has now opened the primary phase to become an all-through school, that is not new and growing. Okay. An established infant school that is now expanding into Key Stage 2, that would not be classed as a new and growing school. The reason being is that it's been open open for more than 7 years in all likelihood. Now, if you've had a free school that's only been open 2 years and it opened as an infant and now is going to expand into primary, that's fine because it hasn't been open long enough. Okay, so the key bit is the new as well as growing. It can only have been opened in the last 7 years. A school becoming an academy, or an academy reconverting, if you like, it's been rebrokered, those do not count as new and growing. Okay, so the school becoming an academy does not restart the clock. Okay, it does not do that. We will have a list of who we believe are new and growing. We will check it against that. If you are challenged on that one, but you are absolutely certain that it is not new and growing, or you're absolutely certain that it is new and growing, then let us know. We may come back and say, no, you haven't got that quite right. Or we may say, absolutely fine, no problem. Okay, but we will have a list. What we won't do is pre-populate that column for you, because there are occasions where the data we hold is not as accurate as what you hold closer to the scene. So we assume that all are no, and you will change the ones that you believe are new and growing, that they fit the criteria said there. Okay. This makes sure that a provider is not affected by the affordability adjustment and the lump sum proportion of their money. That proportion will unwind as they get bigger, but they receive all due funding in the meantime. Okay, so that's what the new and growing factor does. So if you have a school that you haven't shown as new and growing, and we say that it is, you do need to check that the overall formula remains affordable, because it may be that there's some gains that the LA hadn't got calculated for the school may get passed through, because the new and growing schools factor, if you like, removes the cap and scale. Okay, so that they get any gains due to them. It doesn't happen often, but if we do come back on a new and growing school not being shown, then you do need to check that affordability is still fine. Another area on the local factors worksheet is we do ask for the number of high needs pupils in units at schools in your local authority. It's columns Q to V. And we use these to calculate the occupied and unoccupied place rates for academies, and therefore the DSG adjustments that we make to your payments. It does not change the number of places that an LA provider is allocated, and specifically academies are allocated. Okay, so the process for that, if you want to change the number of places that we will pay an academy for and deduct from your DSG, you need to use the place change process that launched through the Galaxy Key process with an Excel file that went out earlier this week. And I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on. If no one's got any queries about that, great. But I will talk very quickly about that later, just to reassure colleagues on that one. So if you want to change place numbers at academies, that's where you do it. You do not do it in the APT, because we won't use them from the APT. What the APT is asking for is how many pupils in the October 22 census are in a high needs unit. We will then compare that to the number of places that we are allocating in agreement with you. And if the number in the APT is less, then clearly there are unoccupied places. And so we will pay unoccupied places to the academy at 10 grand for each one of those, and we'll deduct the same from your DSG. If the number in the APT is the same or more, then all of the places that you have commissioned via the place change process are deemed occupied, and will pay the academy £6,000 for each one and deduct from your DSG at £6,000 for each one. Okay, so it is not about the places there, it will be about how we treat those places as occupied and unoccupied. NNDR changes. We're continuing the new approach. We're hoping that more local authorities and their billing authorities can interact with the new approach, and you should put the NFF indicative values in the local factors column X. We will provide those to you. You should drop those in. Do not reflect expected conversions. The recoupment process will account for that and adjust as required. You should then put what you believe, possibly from your billing authority or the colleagues that are responsible for the NNDR values. You put those in a separate sheet and they'll inform the next NFF settlement. That should say these values will inform the 24-25 NFF settlement, not the 23-24 one, apologies, because the 23-24 NFF settlements, the score allocations for that have already been published. So I'm slightly out on that. So I'll adjust that in the slides before they go out, Alex. Any adjustments for this year, you put in column Y. Again, don't use it to reflect reductions due to in-year conversions. We'll account for that. Okay. The in-year recoupment will deal with the change in liabilities caused by conversion. Okay, so we're continuing the process, and we're expecting that more billing authorities, LAs, will be able to use the new process of claiming for NNDR funding. So exceptional circumstances and premises costs. Columns AD to AH are the local factors, and it's where additional costs are faced by a provider outside the usual expected costs of running a school, such as rent of an additional building, joint usage. It may be that the village hall is used for certain parts of the curriculum or part of the school day, and that needs to be rented out. That is where those sorts of things are put. Of course, there are limitations on that about the number of providers who can have money under that and what proportion of their budget that value contributes. Okay. Any non-premises costs should be included in the minimum per pupil funding calculation. So to make sure that that has been applied correctly, you must add in column I any funding that is an exceptional circumstance that's been agreed but isn't premises funding. Okay. Now we have had the occasional one of those, and if it's been approved, yes, you put it in as an exceptional circumstance. But if it's not premises funding, excuse me, you also need to list it in column AI to make sure that the minimum per pupil funding calculation operates correctly. Okay. As I say, most LAs don't have exceptional circumstances by their very nature, they're exceptional. But do make sure that the MPPFL operates accurately if you have got a non-premises factor in there. Okay, it should be no more than the total of the values in columns AD to AH. It will only be a part of it. But it must relate, but the element in column AI must be solely about non-premises elements. Moving on from local factors. Okay, the DSG block transfers sheet. This allows us to monitor where money has been transferred in and out of the school's block and where it's been transferred to. We need you to record your school's block award in the DSG to start with, so make sure that you include that accurately. We then need to know how much have you transferred out of the school's block into one of the other blocks. So have you moved into most commonly to the high needs block, and potentially how much has been transferred in. Sometimes there's money transferred into the school's block from reserves, from unspent from the previous year, for example. There's sometimes support from the NHS that comes in. So please also show what that, any values for where it's come in. In all those cases, we need a description of what that's about. If you put a value in and you don't give us any information about what it's for and where it's come from, then we will follow up with you and ask for that to be added in. So please do add that when you put a transfer in or out. We don't need anything other than totals moved out of each block. We don't need lots of individual transfer detail, but the overall, what's the value that's gone to the CSSB or the high needs block, etc. So on this page, any one-off funding, we need the balance. We don't need all the ins and outs. On recoupment, that table, that worksheet shows the values that ESFA will be recouping from your DSG payments, and it's showing the allocation that your formula has attributed to all of your mainstream academies. Okay. LAs are responsible for funding basic need growth for schools and academies, and also for the whole of the financial year, April to August and September to March. If that basic need funding starts in September 23 and goes through to the following year, we would still expect you to fund it, but we will deduct from recoupment. If you go to the recoupment tab and look at the total recoupable value, you'll notice that the formula removes the value from the recoupment of the amount of basic need growth paid in April to August. Okay, so we expect you to pay it because you can pay it more quickly and you are aware of what the basic need is at an academy and at the right value, but we will then take that off the amount we're going to deduct from you. So in the end, it is if they essentially are paying for that, and we're acknowledging that is because of the academic year timeline that Academy's financial year runs on. Okay, so you will pay it, but we'll then deduct that value from the recoupment amount. So you pay it, but we essentially then give it you back by not deducting the same amount from the overall formula recoupment. Okay. The September to March payment, we then deduct that from any academies who are funded on an in-year census. That avoids double funding. So we don't deduct it from you for the September to March like we do for April to August, but the September to March value is accounted for and reconciled against any money that we are paying some academies in your local authority if they are funded on the in-year census. Now, some schools will be on the in-year census, like a relatively new free school, because we fund them on their estimate and then adjust to the in-year value. But we can't tell what's basic need and what isn't. So what we will do is adjust for the pupils that they've gained or lost, but then adjust for the cash value that you've paid them in basic need as well. Okay, so that avoids double funding, but we don't deduct from you because you are responsible for basic need funding in the first instance. Okay. Some other changes that are specific to 23-24, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about this to hopefully offset any issues and queries as we get to the business end of the APT process. The factor for looked after children funding in the general annual grant has been removed. Now, funding was removed from the DSG a few years ago and went into the pupil premium, but LAs could still use that factor if they wanted. We've now got to the stage where so few LAs used that factor that it was felt that the point had come where we could remove it from the list of factors in the model. Okay, so there were a handful or so of LAs that used the looked after children factor up until 22-23. It is no longer an option. Okay. Another area that is no longer an option is that EAL funding could be chosen by LAs based on whether a child had been in the system for 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. The NFF funded LAs for 3-year pupils, and the vast majority of LAs used EAL3 as their factor. Very few used 1 and 2. So we have now removed that option, and all schools will be funded for EAL3 volumes of pupils. Just a point to note, we get these inquiries, and I'm pretty sure you do as well, that some schools will say, well, I've got some EAL pupils, but I'm not getting any EAL funding. And that's, of course, because not all EAL pupils attract funding. If they've been in the English school system for more than 3 years, then they won't attract funding. They don't have to have been in the school they're in now. So if they've moved from one school to another, it's where they first appeared, when they first appeared in an England census concurrently. Okay, so what's the most recent start date? And if it's been more than 3 years ago and they have EAL in the flag in the census, then they won't attract funding because they've been there in the system for more than 3 years, irrespective of which school that was. And the other thing that we are tightening the range in terms of what LAs can use in comparison to the NFF values and what they used in the past. If the gap between a factor that you used last year and the NFF factor was £100, we will be expecting and limiting that gap to be no more than £90 for 23-24. So we'll be expecting a 10% tightening of the unit costs being used for the factor values. This is part of the journey towards the full NFF. And so that tightening is applied to all LAs for all of the pupil-led factors plus the lump sum. Okay. Where that is not happening, you'll get a message to say in the APT that you need to reconsider the unit cost that you're putting in. If you are deemed very close to the NFF already, then you have a 2.5% range for which your unit costs can move from last year to this. Okay, so if you are pretty close to it, then you have got some scope to move, but it's more where you are at quite a distance away from most factors. Then the scope to move closer is at least 10%. The other element, the school supplementary grant has been added to the baselines for 23-24. So you can amend that funding value and the number enrolled if you've had some structural changes in the provider, in your provider list. So if subsequently you've had a merged school, the sum should be the original amounts minus one lump sum that was provided in the school supplementary grant. So any demerged schools should have one lump sum each. So in the NFF, we've calculated a per pupil rate based upon their expected pupil numbers after the split and added a lump sum each. Okay, so the school supplementary grant is in the baseline now. So if some schools, when you submit your reveal your allocations to them, say, where's my school supplementary grant gone? It's now in the baseline and part of the allocation in the same way as the teacher pay and pension grants were rolled in to the main allocation grant. Okay. PR dates. You must still distribute your allocations to schools by the 28th of February. If you submit an APT with a sign-off date showing the 27th to 28th, that's pretty close to the date that you've got to get them out by. And if we're still coming back to you and the model needs re-signing off, then you're at risk of missing the required date under the regulations to get the allocations out to schools. So if you've got a point that your provider level allocations will be signed off earlier in February, possibly by the Section 151 officer, that's the appropriate delegated authority, and that's the date that we're happy to take. Okay. If any dates in March are simply too late, and note that the 25th and 26th is a weekend, so those dates aren't appropriate to say to get the sign off. Okay. It doesn't need to be the point that the council chief executive is signing off the full accounts, the full budget that includes libraries and parks and adult social care. We're talking about the point that you are comfortable that your school allocations are not going to change. Okay. And if that date is earlier in February, then by all means, please put that one in. Okay. I'll thank you very much, colleagues, for joining us. Again, you don't need to join this tomorrow afternoon. It will be a repeat. Thank you for your attention. I'm glad the technology held together, and I will bid you a very good afternoon.